He arrived on a Thursday. I remember because I had just put away the groceries and the front door creaked open before I could even call out to my husband. I thought it was him, back early from a hardware store, but instead it was a tall, sunburnt man in a denim jacket with a duffel slung over one shoulder and the kind of quiet confidence that didn't belong to anyone I had seen in this house before. And then I realized, it was him, the nephew, grown, broader, older. He hadn't been around for years. The last time I saw him, he was a lanky college kid who barely made eye contact and wore too much cologne. Now he had lines at the corners of his eyes and arms that looked like they'd done real work. He smiled casually, but there was something behind it. Not charm, exactly. More like a quiet awareness that the air shifted when he entered the room. And it had. I pretended it hadn't. That was always my skill, after all. Pretend just right. My husband greeted him with the usual firm masculinity. Back slap, half hug, and I stood to the side, offering a polite smile and a glass of water. No hugs from me, but my fingers brushed his when he took the glass, and I noticed instantly that he didn't look away. His eyes lingered on mine with something too direct. Not inappropriate, not yet, but definitely not forgettable. He was supposed to stay a few days. A work transition, a relationship that ended on difficult terms, a need to reset, the usual polite language people use to explain needing space. My husband offered the guest room, the shed keys, the car on weekends. I offered clean towels and quiet distance. The first few days passed without note. We kept a respectful rhythm. He ran early in the morning, shirtless, music in his ears. I baked more than I usually did, which was unlike me. I don't even enjoy sweets, but I liked the routine, liked the rhythm of rolling out dough while his footsteps echoed on the porch. I told myself it was nothing. People notice people. That's human. But by the fourth day, I stopped being able to ignore the way his presence shifted the tone of the house. At dinner, he made my husband laugh. Real, deep laughter I hadn't heard in months. My husband would look at me with affection, but the kind reserved for something reliable.
Familiar.
Something you never imagine losing. I had become the stable fixture. Justidiande. The dependable wife. But somewhere quietly, I had also become unseen. The change wasn't in him. It was in me. I noticed myself more. The way I'd pause before choosing a sweater. The way I spent a little longer brushing my hair, noticing how it curled when damp. I had always worn practical clothing, but that week, I found myself reaching for something softer, just to remember how it felt. And then there was the bathroom. It was a humid afternoon. I had come upstairs to find my phone, when I heard the shower running. The bathroom door was open, just a crack, just enough to see fog on the mirror and his jeans in a pile near the sink. I turned to leave. I swear I did, but the sound of the water stopped, and before I could move, the door opened fully. He stood there with a towel low on his hips, water glistening on his chest, and for a second, a brief moment, he looked at me not like a relative, not like a guest, but like someone seeing someone else, fully. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I didn't even move. I just watched him walk past me into the hallway, his arm brushing mine as he passed, and he didn't say a word. The silence between us that night at dinner was noticeable. My husband asked him about jobs in Portland, asked if he planned to date again. He answered easily, but when I asked if he needed anything for his room, his eyes met mine for just a moment too long. He smiled. No, he said, everything's just fine. I don't remember what I said next, or if I said anything at all. Later that night, lying beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling and felt like I had stepped into a different version of myself. Something in me had stirred, quietly, without permission. Not desire, not yet. Something more subtle, but more dangerous. Recognition, that was the word. And the hardest part wasn't that he had looked at me that way. It was that I had looked back. The next morning, I opened my closet and pulled out that satin bra again. Not because I planned anything, Not because I needed it, just because I wanted to remember what it felt like to dress in a way that made me feel noticed. And I knew then, before anything ever happened, that something already had. Not with a touch, not with a kiss, with a glance. And some things, once seen, can never be unseen. The next morning began like any other, but nothing about me felt ordinary. I moved through the kitchen with an exaggerated calmness, setting down mugs, slicing fruit, listening to the hum of the refrigerator as if silence itself were something to be cautious of. He came in late, hair still damp, skin warm from his run, and nodded to me with that same quiet confidence he hadn't had before. My husband had already left for work. Something about a meeting or a delivery, details that passed through me without landing. Lately, his presence in our home felt more like the ticking of a dependable clock. Constant, necessary, and entirely predictable. He kissed me on the temple before he left, and I pretended not to notice how little I felt from it. No spark.
No flinch.
Just emotion made out of routine. The nephew sat at the counter, scrolling on his phone. What's on the agenda today? I asked. He shrugged. Thought I'd hit the hardware store. Fix that hinge on the porch door. Of course he would. Lately, every gesture from him seemed perfectly casual, helpful. And yet, it all felt layered, like something more was quietly stitched into every glance, every movement. He worked outside for hours, while I reorganized cabinets that didn't need it. I changed clothes twice, first jeans and a tank top, then a soft dress with a low back I hadn't worn in over a year. It was one of those garments you don't wear for comfort, but to remember a version of yourself you once were. Around 3, the sky shifted. One of those summer storms rolled in, loud and sudden. Rain hit the windows hard, casting a gray softness through the rooms. He came inside soaked, laughing to himself as he dried his face. Didn't see that coming, he said. You're dripping all over my floor. He looked at the puddle, then at me. Want me to change right here? It was a light remark, a carrel joke, but it landed in the space between us like something sharp. I turned quickly, covering the warmth rising in my cheeks. I told him to leave his shoes on the mat, to grab a towel. I told him everything except the one thing I was actually thinking. The moment passed, but not entirely. That evening, with the storm behind us and the smell of wet leaves in the air, he offered to help with dinner. I said yes. He chopped. I grilled. Our arms brushed twice. I apologized once. He didn't respond either time. The kitchen felt smaller than it had the night before. By the time the food was ready, night had settled. We ate on the porch, the breeze now cool. I poured a second glass of wine, more than I needed.
I leaned back, watching the sky.
You ever think about doing something unplanned? Just to feel alive? I didn't answer right away. I watched his jaw as he spoke, the way his throat moved as he swallowed. Depends what you mean by unplanned, I said. He looked at me, that pause again, still, charged. You know what I mean. The porch lights flickered in the wind. Don't say things like that, I whispered. Why not? It wasn't a dare. It was. Then it happened. No warning, no rehearsed line. He leaned in, his hand grazing my cheek, and kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't wild. It was quiet, intentional. The kind of moment that asks a question you already know the answer to. And I kissed him back. There was no fear, no shame, just heat. And then I stopped. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt too right. I stood so fast my glass nearly tipped. My heartbeat was so loud I thought the neighbors might hear. I have to go, I said, even though I was already home. I left him on the porch and walked upstairs like a flame trying not to catch. Not from shame, but from memory.
From sensation.
From the knowledge that my lips remembered him more clearly than they'd remembered my husband in months. In the mirror, I didn't look like myself. My cheeks were flushed. My collarbone rose and fell like I'd run a mile. I undressed slowly, each layer feeling like a confession. I stood in the shower for 15 minutes, water hot, trying to rinse off something that wasn't visible. That night, my husband slept beside me like he always did, mouth slightly open, arms neatly folded. I stared at the ceiling again, not with fear, with clarity. I knew it now. That wasn't a moment I could undo. Not because we had crossed some obvious line, but because I had remembered what it was like to be truly seen. Directly, completely, and I wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. The morning after felt like waking up inside a different skin. I moved slowly, methodically, pouring coffee into my cup as though the weight of the ceramic might anchor me to something stable. My husband stood near the sink, scrolling through his phone, his presence routine and quiet. He glanced at me briefly and said something about needing to check on the sprinkler system before work. I nodded, pretending I heard. My ears were still ringing with the silence I had. I caught my own reflection in the window, hair slightly tousled, neckline loose. There was a glow in my face that had nothing to do with the morning sun. My lips still tingled, not from contact, but from thought. It lingered, clung to the edges of my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't turn from. I had stepped across something, not visible to others, but unmistakable to me. And the hardest part? I didn't feel regret. Not exactly. What I felt was longing, not for disorder or secrecy, but for that sharp, undeniable awareness I thought I had left behind years ago. He was already outside when I walked past the window, shirt off again, hammer in hand, fixing a loose board on the fence. His back moved with each motion, steady and focused. I lingered longer than I should have, holding a dish towel like it was a reason to stay. The day passed in a blur of small, clumsy mistakes. I overcooked lunch. I spilled detergent. I walked into a room and forgot why. But I knew exactly what I was avoiding, being alone with him, because I wasn't sure I trusted myself not to lean too far this time. In the late afternoon, after my husband had gone for a meeting across town, I heard footsteps on the stairs. I was standing in the hallway, folding laundry that didn't need folding, when his voice came low, close. You've been avoiding me. I didn't turn. I folded a towel. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept my posture calm, as if stillness could steady everything. We shared a moment. That doesn't mean, it means something, he said, cutting me off. I turned then slowly. Our eyes met and held. You're my husband's nephew, and you're his wife, so who carries more weight? I should have stopped the conversation there. I should have turned away, returned to habit, but I didn't. I stepped into the guest room and closed the door, not as an invitation, but to gather myself. He didn't follow. That was the problem. He didn't rush after me like... He just stood there, calm, leaning on the railing, watching. That kind of quiet doesn't belong to youth. That kind of stillness belongs to someone who understands risk, and still steps forward. That night at dinner, everything tasted dull. The food, the wine, the conversation. My husband laughed at a radio joke and asked him about interviews. He answered kindly. I smiled in the right places, but I wasn't really present. I was still at the staircase. Stikog As I cleared the dishes, I noticed a trace of his cologne on the back of the chair. It was subtle, warm, unfamiliar, the kind of scent that doesn't belong in your house but fits like it does. I went to bed early, claiming a headache. My husband offered me a painkiller and kissed my shoulder. I nodded, swallowed, closed my eyes, and lay still. I listened to the quiet of the house, the whir of the ceiling fan. At some point, I realized I was still wearing the satin bra I had put on that morning. I hadn't even noticed. Or maybe I had. Maybe I just hadn't wanted to take it off. Sometime past midnight, I heard quiet steps in the hallway. Measured, careful. I didn't move. I listened. They passed my door, paused, then kept walking toward the kitchen. Water ran. A cabinet. Closed. A refrigerator door opened. Then, silence again. It wasn't just the kiss anymore. It was everything after it. Every breath, every choice. The way I started watching the clock around the time he usually came back from errands.
The way I adjusted my blouse before entering a room.
The way my skin remembered his presence more vividly than any moment with my husband in months. And still, I hadn't touched him again. But everything in me knew it was coming. Not like a storm, not like fate, like permission. Something I hadn't allowed myself in years. And when I finally closed my eyes, the last thing I saw was the way his hand had brushed against the doorframe earlier. Casual, barely noticeable, but because in that small, ordinary moment, I realized something quietly startling. I didn't just want him to kiss me again. I wanted to kiss him back, with intention. The days that followed didn't feel like days. They passed more like fragments, interrupted, scenes from a life I could no longer keep whole. The morning routine remained intact, the smell of coffee, the click of the garage door as my husband left, the hum of the news radio. But the silence that filled the in-between had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It vibrated with tension, electric, almost musical in its ache. He was still in the house, still moving through it like it belonged to him as much as it belonged to us. And maybe in unseen ways it did now. Ways my husband would never notice. I watched the way he leaned on door frames, how he carried mugs of coffee in one hand and a book in the other, how he sat in the living room late at night, with the lamp on, shirt off, legs stretched out, like this temporary life could quietly become permanent. I avoided him with the precision of someone practicing restraint, not because I didn't want to be near him, but because I already knew what might happen if I let myself cross that line again. Once, I caught myself adjusting my hair before walking into the same room as him, and I hated the quiet excitement that stirred in me from something so small. I hadn't dressed for attention in years.
I dressed to be appropriate.
To be put together, to meet expectations. Now, I dressed in ways that made me feel noticed. One afternoon, I stepped outside to check the plants on the back patio. I wasn't expecting him to be there, and for a moment I froze. He was seated on the steps, elbows resting on his knees, a cigarette between his fingers, a habit he hadn't revealed until that moment. He didn't look up at first, just said quietly, "Do you ever think about what people—" I stayed silent.
The wind stirred the edge of the tablecloth.
Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed. Then he turned toward me. His eyes weren't playful. They were steady, searching, but not for approval. "I mean," he said, "if anyone found out." I sat down, not close, but not far either. I wasn't sure if it was defiance or curiosity, maybe both. "I think about what I would say to myself," I answered finally. He smiled, but it wasn't from amusement. It was heavier than that. He flicked the cigarette into a coffee can, stood up, and stretched as though the air around us wasn't heavy with things unsaid. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not going to do anything. Not unless you ask me to." And then he walked inside, leaving me there with my heartbeat fluttering in my chest. That night, we were invited to a neighborhood gathering, something my husband insisted we attend. One of those summer grill-outs where everyone brings potato salad in glass bowls and talks about lawn care like it's a sacred ritual. I dressed simply, but the moment I stepped into the backyard, I felt exposed. Not because of the dress, but because of the feeling that someone was already watching me before I'd even turned around. He was already there, laughing with two women from the end of the street, beer bottle in hand. He looked like someone who belonged in photographs, someone who didn't mind being the center of attention. And then he saw me. His smile faded, just for a beat, then returned like it had never left. We moved through the party like orbiting planets,
Never touching,
never colliding, but I felt him. Every glance, every pause, every time he looked away and then back when no one else noticed. It was maddening. At some point, my husband disappeared inside to help with drinks. I found myself near the hedge alone, breathing slow, hoping the fabric of my dress would cool the heat